everyone, and welcome to Book It. I'm Carol Anne Riddell. We begin today with author Chloé Cooper Jones. Her candid and widely praised memoir, Easy Beauty, topped best book lists and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Chloé, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And congratulations on the book.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I'd like to start our conversation where you start the book. The first couple of lines of the prologue read, "I'm in a bar in Brooklyn listening as two men, my friends, discuss whether or not my life is worth living." I have to say that really took my breath away. It is so powerful and so disturbing and so candid. Can you take us back to that conversation?
Yeah, I was meeting some friends and a conversation about bioethics came up. We were all philosophy students, and I was teaching a bioethics course. We were talking about a really famous bioethics case that has to do with disability, and in the course of that conversation, a discussion began about whether or not the disabled life is worth living, and one of the members of this group was arguing that there was something that he believed was so inherently negative about disability that it made the entirety of a life not worth living. And I, as a disabled woman, I sat there in that moment recognizing that this was definitely not the first time that I'd heard this argument. That's not the issue with that moment and why it was so transformative to me. I mean, every disabled person grows up and hearing an argument over and over and over again that their lives are somehow lesser or that they are other in some sort of way. The thing that was so transformative about that moment and why it's the sort of inciting incident for the entirety of the book is that it was the first time that I really recognized my own tendency to retreat into sort of a separated protective space when I was in a moment in which I was experiencing any sort of pain or discomfort. And in that moment, I recognized that instead of engaging with these two men or having a productive conversation or arguing for the absolute value of my life or bodies like mine, that what I wanted to do was to absent myself completely and just allow the moment to pass. And it was the first time that I recognized that was a problem. For me, to do that means that I'm partially complicit in such bad beliefs about disability. So that moment becomes an impetus for me to seek out a way of changing myself.
And Chloé, you were born with a rare condition, sacral agenesis. Can you explain that for people who may not be familiar with it?
Yeah, I was born without a sacrum, and that's a bone in your spine that sort of connects your spinal column to your hips, controls a set of nerves that communicate to muscles basically below my knees and my feet. So I have limited mobility, especially in my knees down. I also have hip dysplasia, which is the sort of center of a pain disorder that I have. And hip dysplasia simply means that the ball and socket joints in my hips don't line up.
Yeah.
And so I have, as a result, a sort of swaying side-to-side walk that's very distinctive. And I also have a lot of pain that stems from the combination of these
And you talk about that chronic pain in the book and how you have learned to cope with it by retreating into what you call the neutral room.
Yeah.
Can you describe that?
Yeah, when I was very young, my orthopedic surgeon explained to me that a lot of the pain that I would feel in my life would be anticipatory pain, which is true for all of us.
Yeah, isn't that, it's so interesting and so true, isn't it?
Absolutely. He said a lot of the pain that you're experiencing is the fear of the pain to come. And so, for example, when I would get up, and I still feel this way, I'd get up and I'd know how long my day was ahead of me, or how many subways I'd have to take that day or whatever it was, I would already begin to hold the pain in my body. And so he said that there's a way to sort of try to manage anticipatory pain, which would then decrease the amount of pain that I felt overall. And that was to go inside a sort of separated, static mental place. He said, make it look the same every single time. So mine is windowless room with white walls, and he said project numbers onto that wall. And so I count to 8, and he said, whatever pain you're feeling isn't going to last past 8 seconds. Part of the issue with with this neutral room is that it's a space of great power and agency and safety for me, in the sense that it creates a separation from the pain that I may be feeling physically, or allows me a sort of sense of control over that pain. But, and this is certainly the sort of what happens at the beginning of the book, it also can be a place where I can retreat from social pain. And sometimes that's okay, but in the case of listening to these men who are arguing that perhaps my life is not worth living, in that particular moment, separating myself into this, sort of dissociated mental space is a way of absenting myself from responsibilities in the present moment, or just simply experiencing a present moment that I must experience.
And Chloé, my reading of the book was very much around that struggle, that you, on the one hand, want to be very much present in your life and with other people, and then on the other hand, really want to retreat and put some distance there.
Yeah.
Did a lot of that change for you when your son was born?
Yeah.
Wolfgang?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, kids, man, they, they really demand that that you not just sort of identify how one ought to be in the world, but that you model that behavior.
Yes, exactly.
That's so frustrating, because
Yes.
when I would see my son emulating some of the behaviors that I had, the sort of desire to be isolated, or a certain distrust of strangers or people coming closer, a sort of resistance to vulnerability, it's not enough to say, like, it's okay, you can trust people, you should be open, you actually have to
do it.
You have to do it.
Have to show it, yes.
Yeah, it's really it's a rude thing about parenting.
Being a mom was not something you had anticipated, right? Because you had been told that pregnancy was likely not possible for you. Is that right?
Yes, and this is something I also later learned that is very common for disabled women. I was just told at a very young age, that I just simply would never get pregnant. My mother and I both trusted this to be fact. Our doctors said it, more than one doctor said it, and looking back, we really didn't challenge that or ask questions or say, why exactly? Why is my disability a disqualification for becoming pregnant? And I think that, the larger truth is there's so much stigma around like sexual agency for disability that I think more than anything, the assumption was I just wouldn't have a partner or have a life like this. And so,
which is so heartbreaking to hear that, but yes, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, and there's a lot of research around this now that I've looked into where, there's a great sort of study about this that's just titled, What Happened to You? And it comes from the fact that when especially disabled women are pregnant, that's sort of the question you get asked over and over again. I certainly got asked that over and over again, like, what happened? What happened? And you kind of go, well, the normal thing, like I have a husband, and but there was so much stigma that stigma, I think the massive problem with that stigma in my own life was that it equaled a lack of imagination about like what my life could hold.
Could look like, what it might be, yeah. And Chloé, one of the things that you talked about in the book is, and you mentioned this already, when you were a child, you really sort of rejected the notion of disability. You wouldn't say the word disabled, but you said that also left you feeling alone in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I grew up in a culture, in a society that did not project very many positive models for what disability could look like. I very rarely saw disabled characters represented in film or television or even books. And when I did, they were often represented as sort of side characters who were helpful guides to able-bodied people or people who needed to learn some bigger lesson about lives, life's real value. And so often disability was represented as people who had no agency, had no sexuality, and quite often lived a tragic and short life. It sort of became a joke to me. Like every time I'd pick up a book and find a disabled character, I'd be like, oh, they're gonna die soon. I don't die in my book, I live.
You live a great life.
I live, I make mistakes, I have lots of agency. But that model fed to me over and over and over again, created a narrative that was very hard to not internalize, which was that disability somehow equaled pity, that it somehow equaled a lesser existence. And of course, I don't feel that way about myself. And so the only way that I could sort of process this when I was younger was to say, I must not be disabled. That must be this thing that I need to separate or like cleave away from the way that I think about myself, but also, more importantly, the way that anybody could ever think about me. And the way that I did this was to never talk about it, to never acknowledge when I was in pain, to never learn about the history of disability, to not learn about the ADA or the activists who fought so valiantly for the rights that I enjoy. Like, I just really separated myself from that realm of identity. And that's a big journey of this book, is recognizing that to embrace that part of my life, to own it, is not only a way of sort of creating a wholeness within myself, but also, again, and always more crucially, to create a life that I want to model for my son.
Well, we mentioned that Easy Beauty was a finalist for the Pulitzer, which is remarkable, and your first book. Are you working on something new now?
Yes, I am. I sold 2 more books to my same editor, Lauren Ween, who's a genius at Avid Reader Press, and I'm finishing my second book right now.
That's terrific.
Thank you.
And Chloé, I'm always curious about titles. Tell us about the meaning of Easy Beauty.
Well, I have to say that I'm terrible at writing titles, and I would love to take credit. I love this title of Easy Beauty, and I wish I could take credit for it, but it came from my agent. All my title ideas are terrible, and it's become a huge...
I find that a little hard to believe, but
I know, but it's really true. It's a joke now. I'll send all these texts to my agent being like, I think the next book is called this, and then she'll be like, that's really the worst idea anybody's ever had. So that's something I'll work on as a writer. But the idea for the title comes from, or the source of the title comes from an idea from Bernard Bosanquet, a British philosopher, who just simply made a distinction in one of his lectures on aesthetics between easy beauty and difficult beauty.
Sure.
And he said that easy beauty is simply the kind of beauty that arrives to us instantly. Maybe, seeing a rose, seeing a beautiful sunset, hearing a beautiful piece of music that moves you, and just our senses recognize that beauty almost instantly. And he says that that's the kind of beauty that we spend, much of our great pleasure in life comes from the experience of easy beauty.
Yes.
And he says it's important to recognize that there's also this other category, which he calls difficult beauty, which is simply beauty that in order to find it or feel it or experience it, we have to be able to sit with more complexity, perhaps even the feeling of tension that beauty creates in us. And then he also says a third thing, which he calls width. And he says that there is a difficult kind of beauty that can be found when we're in the face of an experience that is so vast that it makes us, in comparison, feel very small. And I think that the experience of motherhood has been that for me, to recognize how vast that experience is, and mine is only a little blip in that history.
Yeah.
The experience of
I
love.
think many moms would say the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So those two concepts play an important role in the book, and my agent, Claudia Ballard, the most brilliant agent on the planet, just sort of went, that's the title. Yeah. All these other titles, let's get rid of those. And she was right.
Just a last question for you, Chloé. What do you hope people take away from your book?
I hope they feel like it's for them. It's very important to me that I didn't write a book that was about, the book is specific. It's about my life, of course, but it's important that the book has much broader aims than just to tell some simple details from one person in Brooklyn's life. So I'm really aiming at illuminating a tiny little corner of, hopefully feels like a very universal thing, which is a desire to change, a recognition that sometimes the spaces that protect us are also the spaces that keep us from the things we want. And my sincere hope is that any reader at all, would feel as though spending 300 pages in contemplation of that threshold and what we want to change, and then just sort of allowing me to tell the story of how I've done that feels extremely resonant and relevant to their lives.
Thank you so much for all this time, Chloe. It was such a pleasure to be able to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Really appreciate it, very grateful. Here on Book It, we love hearing how accomplished professionals in the book world got their start, and we hope you do too. Here's how I did it.
Hi, I'm May Wuthrich, an independent, award-winning audiobook producer and director. I've never been the kind of person who knew exactly what she wanted to do when she grew up. My first real job was in a film company, and I went on to senior positions as a film development executive, where I read, analyzed, and recommended projects, and then worked with the writers on those that were chosen. When I realized that so few films actually made it to the big screen after all that love and all that hard work, well, it just wasn't for me. So I pivoted to the book publishing industry and started a new chapter. And then I had my aha moment when I listened to my first audiobook. I knew instantly that this was where I belonged. This part of publishing drew on all the skills I had developed from when I started as an actor. I loved the theater, I loved working with writers, and I knew how to shape a performance. If there's any lesson here, I think it would be you can't always predict where you're going to end up or how you're going to get there. So keep doing what you're doing. And do it 100%. Keep exploring, keep building skills, and keep challenging yourself. That's how I did it.
We are back with the fine print and talking books to box office. Sometimes going from the page to the screen works beautifully. Other times, not so much. Here to break it down for us is Dr. Tom Means, a CUNY professor and an expert on world cinema. Tom, thanks so much for stopping by today.
Thank you, Carol Anne.
So today we're talking about a book that a lot of people loved, Where the Crawdads Sing. When that book came out, it was something of a surprise smash hit. Is that right?
You mean the fact that the original printing was 28,000 and the last time I checked it had sold 18 million copies?
Wow. Wow.
Well, what happened is that Reese Witherspoon heard about it and put it in her book club, and then it just took off.
The main character in the book is so compelling, Kaya, but it turns out that the author of the book is also very compelling. What's the story there?
So Delia Owens grew up in rural Georgia. And the title of the book is a bit strange, isn't it?
Yeah.
Until you learn that when she was a little girl, and maybe her mom wanted her to burn some energy, she would say, "Delia, get out back, where the crawdads sing."
Your accents again.
So then Delia falls in love with nature. She eventually gets a PhD from University of California in zoology, and then spends almost 23 years in Africa working as a wildlife biologist. So she knows isolation. Sure. She knows the natural world deeply and well.
Now let's talk about the movie. First, tell us about the adaptation.
Sure.
What was involved?
Well, the adaptation is a star-studded team because Reese Witherspoon eventually goes on to produce it.
Yes.
And the theme song was written by Taylor Swift.
Oh yeah, who's that?
Yeah, right.
I mean, it's quite a collection,
Yeah.
right? Yes.
It was a star-studded team. It actually was a box office hit. It made over $100 million profit. But for a lot of critics, it was a little too pretty. Because when I fell in love with the book, and I think you'd say the same thing, we really get to know this girl and her improbable survival by herself in the marshes of North Carolina. So she's gritty, she's resourceful. Her entire existence is, page after page, we're saying, how can this go on?
Yes.
How can this girl survive? So that's what we love so much in the book. Now, in the movie, the critics say that the story was told faithfully. We get to know all the characters.
Okay.
But it's too pretty.
Yeah, just a little too perfect.
In fact, the LA Times called it a Disneyland version of The Marsh.
So if that's what did not work, Tom, what do you think, in your opinion, did work in terms of the book to the movie adaptation?
Well, first of all, I'm sure you feel the same way. When you love a book, sometimes you're just so excited to see the movie.
Agreed.
So I enjoyed the movie because I got to see these characters I had known so well come to life. One thing that both the book and the movie do well is share this message of hope. Mm-hmm. There's this beautiful final scene in the movie where Kaya she's been, I don't want to give any spoiler, but she's free, let's say.
Yes.
And she's where she wants to be, back in deep nature.
Yes.
And the voiceover expresses a message that the novel also ends with, this beautiful vision of hope and this triumph of survival.
Yep, that definitely did come through for me as well.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, thank you, Tom, for coming by. Great to see you.
Thank you, Carol Anne.
All right, appreciate it. Next up, we're going to head over to author and columnist Linda Stasi. She is back, and as always, she's got plenty to say about what she's reading. Here's Uncensored.
If you just woke up from a 50-year coma, you might think, based on current bestsellers, that women hadn't advanced past the "I need a husband" phase, or worse, that we are all sad all the time, and so we need to read cheesy romance or sad stories about women who are even sadder than ourselves. Well, hell, I've had a husband or two. They're not all that hard to find, and no, I'm not sad all the time. Today, I'll tell you about two books that aren't sad all the time, but end up sappy anyway. Echo of Old Books by Barbara Davis has a very clever book within a book and time-skipping format. It jumps between the 1980s and the 1940s. Ashley is a bookbinder who also owns an old bookshop. But yes, she is sad, mostly because her mean, cheater ex-husband is dead, very dead. Then one day, two books with no publisher and no author fall into her hands. Turns out they are books written by two star-crossed lovers who met in 1941. The first book, By a Man, is an ode to everything that she did to hurt him. The second book, by his former lover, answers with everything he did to her. Ashley goes on a hunt to find the authors and teams up with the man who brought the books into her shop in the first place. The format is intriguing and the characters are interesting, even though they all suffer from loveophobia, or the fear of taking a chance on love. This is a very fun read and a good read until the end, when it goes as cheesy and gooey as a pound of melted Velveeta. However, as I am undaunted by cheese, I dove headlong into Hello, Beautiful by Ann Napolitano, which was Oprah's 100th book club pick. The novel was described by one reviewer as Little Women but with basketball. I call it more like Big Women with some basketball. The book spans nearly 5 decades in the lives of the Padovano sisters and is mostly told from the perspective of sisters Julia and Sylvie and Julia's sometime husband, the 6'7" William. Julia meets William in college and brings him home to the family, who seem like the hideously stereotypical Italian family, but then they aren't. For starters, they only eat TV dinners. But William's family is as cold as the Arctic used to be, so he loves what he thinks of as the warm and cuddly Padovanos. Wrong. Out of nowhere, the Padovano mother, Rose, who only lives for her daughters and her vegetable garden, decides after her husband dies, a man she didn't like in the first place, that she doesn't even like her daughters either. So she moves to Florida. What? That being said, after a while, I couldn't find anybody I liked either. But trust me, I'd rather pull my own skin off than move to Florida. For Uncensored, I'm Linda Stasi.
That wraps up another chapter for us. Thanks so much for being here. We'd love to know what you think and what you're reading, so please check us out on social media. I'm Carol Anne Riddell. We'll see you next time on Book It.